Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining us today. It's great that you're here with us, and thank you for sharing your precious time and energy with us. As always, whether you're live or you're watching us on replay, we do appreciate you being here and being interested in this topic. We are, as you know, in the month of March, and month of March for us is the theme of month of March for us is culture immersion. And we already began this topic last week with a conversation with Dr. Suzanne Wertheim and Audrey Braun when we talked about emotional literacy. And we have also been having these conversations within our community. So just sharing the link here so you can join us and have these conversations before these lives. And from last week, when we were talking about emotional literacy, and also this week's conversation about intercultural communications and intercultural intelligence, the interesting pattern that is coming up through these topics is that both emotional literacy and intercultural communications are the very foundations of evolved and effective leadership. However, not necessarily these topics are treated that way.
Hi, sorry.
No worries, you're welcome. And so often these conversations of intercultural communications and emotional literacy, like I said, that are an absolute core of effective leadership, are often talked about and researched and trained in their own silos, but not part of the wider organizational culture or leadership. And even more so, I have witnessed very little trainings as part of learning and development within organizations to specifically develop these skills, which is ironic, considering that today many organizations are loud and proud of just how multicultural or how diverse their workforce are. However, the importance here is not just the demographic numbers and how they appear within the organization, but how do we add and derive value from cultural diversity. And so for any international business, the failure to understand the cultural differences, to understand the cultural differences can bear serious consequences, can be a huge failure. And how, I will explain and I will explore today with my two guests as part of the conversation today. And both of my guests today are intercultural communication specialists in their own right, and I'm excited for all of you to meet them. Before you do that, I just want to let you know that the chat, as always, is open. So please feel free to sharing comments, reflections, any questions that you might be having as we're going through this conversation. As I said, I've got fantastic specialists here, so this is your time and place to ask any questions around this topic. And while the ladies are introducing themselves, drop us a quick hi in the comments. Let us know where you're dialing in from, and we will get going. And Tina, would you like to kick us off? Tell a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm currently finishing my master's degree in intercultural communication. And we actually, I guess, met through a similar interest in international talents in Finland through a webinar. So yeah, I'll be here to discuss culture in quote marks with you and DEI. So
thank you so much. Thank you. And Lisa, welcome.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to apologize. I had a slight technical glitch this morning. My computer seems to be on its way out, so it froze up on me. But
no problem at all.
So what I do is I'm a communication coach I'm based in New York City, but most of my clients, I'd say 99% of my clients are international. And I work for internationally facing accelerators as well as companies. And I work on communication, voice, delivery, pitching. But what I look at is, first of all, the styles and what everybody brings to the table, because everybody's culture is going to influence how they communicate a little bit differently, as well as their personalities and everything else, their experience that they bring to the table. Then, we want to look at the way that they could build flexibility. Sorry.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, both of you, and thank you for the kind introductions. And I look forward to having this conversation with both of you. And the interesting thing about, as I mentioned earlier, around the last week's conversation around emotional literacy and today's conversation is that these are the very foundations of an evolved and conscious leadership. And that's the kind of leadership that we, need to see within our organizations these days. However, there is not enough understanding of what these notions of emotional literacy and intercultural communications actually mean. And actually, if in some of the previous LinkedIn Lives, I would say, actually, we are starting this conversation assuming that you all know what this means, so let us take it from there. Then I feel that even though these are sort of basic notions, that I think is quite important to actually define them as part of this conversation as well. So I would like to begin there, because there are various definitions and explanations out there that still might be unclear and confusing to some people. So let's begin our conversation today there just by briefly and simply explaining what intercultural communications are, and we will just so we can all join the conversation from the same entry point. And Lisa, would you like to go first? How do you explain to your clients in layman terms what intercultural intelligence or intercultural communications are?
So, like I was saying before, it's really building in that flexibility and understanding your audience, as well as becoming a better listener. So really thinking about, first of all, how you're tuning into the audience. And I think that we're going to talk about this a lot, but what kind of biases you might bring to the table. What I think about, and I've done a lot of work on in workshops, is communication biases in the sense of, voice communication, accent, tone, style, and how we communicate, and how sometimes that might trigger a certain bias in us that we don't even think about, but we might tune out or tune in based on how well we receive this communicator. So, when leadership is, let's say, interviewing or onboarding someone, thinking about their communication style and understanding that they have to listen differently, as well as building in okay, everybody has to communicate in a certain way, is, I think, very important.
Thank you. And you talk about listening a lot, and I'm smiling at it because I think, again, listening is a skill that, again, is not universal. And we talk about listening, and yet within, whenever there is a more of a senior leader or someone sort of senior within an organization present in meetings, often those people tend to talk more or give more answers than actually listen. And yet, when we, again, talk about this conversation or any conversation we're going to be having as part of this month, one of the key things is listening. So thank you for talking about that. Tina, how do you explain intercultural communications in basic terms? Where do you start this conversation?
In a nutshell, it is interactions between different people. That's the baseline, it's the interaction between different people. What we need to kind of go back to, I think, is culture. What do we mean by culture before we can talk about intercultural? Because if you think culture is one thing and I think it's a different thing, then it doesn't matter how much we talk about intercultural communication, we're not talking about the same thing. So for me, that's like the essence, the core of intercultural communication, is making sure that we're on the same page. And for me, the way I understand culture and the way I understand intercultural communication is, it is everything that we do and that is around us, but it's also nothing at the same time. So it's very complex and intersectional and fluid. It doesn't have, it's a living, breathing thing. It doesn't have a specific box that it fits into. And so different people interact in the same or seemingly similar situation very differently based on various other factors. So, the conversation might be on the same topic, the people might be the same, but it's a different day, you're in a different mood, and you've got a different identity that you're bringing to the table that particular discussion. So, we need to think about identity layers as well. And it's very complex, but in a nutshell, it's interaction between people. So, yeah.
Thank you. And it's really interesting because just before we jumped on the live, as we were just testing our sound and light and everything, Tina, we were talking about the fact that, we as, people, we are comfort creatures, and we need to put everything in boxes, and we need to make sense out of everything. And the moment we can't do it, then something's wrong, and usually something is wrong with the other party, obviously, because our box is the right box, and our box is what other people should be assimilated. And so, in terms of the sort of intercultural communications, it surely isn't just about, being aware of it and knowing how to apply it. It surely isn't just about avoiding of being misunderstood or not offending someone. We have seen Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and many other big brands get it incredibly wrong. However, what about everyday communications that we might be having within our workplaces and communities? What makes intercultural communication so important in these contexts? And perhaps you might have some examples from what you witnessed, what you've seen, in where intercultural communications have turned out to be vital and where they have gone, or lack of them have gone incredibly wrong.
I could start it off.
Yes, please.
So coming at it now, my training is a little bit different. So like I said, I'm voice and communication coach. I was originally a speech pathologist. I did study intercultural communication, but I apply it to a lot of what we do in the sense of like the startup world and the executive world. Now, I do a lot with the startup world. And like I said, I work here with internationally facing accelerators. I also grew up in New York City, which is sort of the science experiment for intercultural communication. Because when I was growing up here, I grew up on a block with immigrants from all over the world. And every time I'd step into someone's house, it would be a different nationality, background, language background, food cooking. And it was very normal for me to grow up like that. So I ended up building in, I think, a lot of this as a very young person, thinking it was very normal because that was my experience that I was able to bring to the table. When I see it play out in life, it's a little bit different. Now, obviously, going back to what Tina said, there's a lot of layers to this. It could be, Baiba, we met on Chaba's talk. So it was the global disc and how people apply that. And there's some interesting parameters there, but you want to think about people, if they're introverts, extroverts, what kind of communicator they are, if they're very expressive, if they're quiet by nature, if they're very detailed and data driven. And then you want to think about, at least in the world that I work, when I'm coaching people, let's say I'm presenting and pitching, especially for a pitch, everybody's going to come to the table with a little bit of a different information. And that's where the culture is going to inform them. How direct you are, how you're answering questions, how you organize the information, what you think is important up front. Do you need to, dive into the details right away, or do you need to be very big picture? And those types of flexibilities are not the easiest things to learn, but I think that they're very important. Understanding your audience when you're doing something like this, because if you're pitching for funding, obviously you want to speak to the audience that is listening. And unfortunately, a lot of people, especially when they're in power positions, well, I won't say this. I think more and more people are building in that flexibility. I think people are getting more used to that global approach, but not everybody. So people are going to say, okay, so you need to be more direct, or you need to be less direct, or so they're going to, like you said, box it out a little bit more, expecting communication to look one way without taking into consideration where maybe that person is from. So those types of miscommunications can happen pretty easily. But again, it's also depending on what your goal is. How flexible do you need to become within let's say, the market or the audience that you're delivering to?
And the interesting thing that you talk about here is the flexibility, not only of the macro environment, how flexible we are with the environment or the person we interact, but also how flexible we are internally. How do we know when to tune and dial something up and down, and how can we and how do we read the environment to know how we need to come across? So this is, I guess, where it becomes layered and complex, because again, right now we are still in a place where we are talking about basic emotional intelligence and basic self-awareness that many people, and where it becomes harmful is when people in boardrooms and leadership and decision-making roles lack that emotional intelligence and self-awareness, and they don't know how to dial up and down or how to be flexible with themselves and as they interact in the environment. And that's when sort of the boxes become, even more rigid and even more so of them. So I love that you talk about how layered it is and how flexible we need to be with ourselves as well as how we interact. Because communications, we often talk about, interaction. So it means that we are interacting with something, be it environment or a person. But actually, there is a lot that we have to do with ourselves first and foremost before we can even, talk about interacting with someone else. Thank you for that perspective. Tina, how would you look at that?
What was the question again? I've completely forgotten because I was so focused on Lisa's answer that
No. It's and really just exploring what makes intercultural communication so important, and perhaps if you have any examples that you have a witness of where it has gone very well, where intercultural communications have been appreciated and taken into account, and where it has gone not right at all.
So I would argue that it's very hard to pinpoint what is and is not intercultural communication because, like I said before, everything is culture and nothing is culture specifically. So intercultural communication doesn't have to happen in environments where we have this like visible cultural diversity. It actually happens in a lot of seemingly homogenous groupings as well. So things that are culture, for example, are somebody's sexual orientation, their age, their gender. All of these are, amongst socioeconomic standing and all of these things, educational background. These are, layers of culture. So when we consider those being in like a supposedly homogenous grouping, and then we add in also linguistic diversity, ethnic diversity, different races, we add in all of these other layers on top of that, then, it becomes a whole big intersectional mess of communication. It's very hard to draw the line between what is and is not intercultural communication because, as I see it, essentially all communication is intercultural. You might just not know it. You might just be not aware of it. So, yeah.
Lisa, you're smiling.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to
resonates.
Put it. Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it because, again, I think when you think about how we communicate, let's say across ages, I mean, sometimes you're going to lose things in communication, and also you see it. I mean, you see it playing out in the world right now. How people take in information, how people who believes what kind of information, what demographics are targeted when certain information is put out there. People who are tech savvy, less tech savvy, what like you said, gender orientation. But there's so much, and again, I think coming from New York, you see, this is like, it's sort of the science experiment for this because there's so many little bubbles of diversity in and of themselves that you see everywhere in a cafe or on the train, and you just see people grouping together. So it's very interesting that you said that. So I love that. That was actually very interesting, Tina.
And the interesting aspect of that as well, speaking about how potentially every conversation and every conversation is intercultural communication. Even if we look at our micro environments within our families, as you just mentioned, there are different identities there, generations, ages, ethnicities, perhaps, nationalities, perhaps. So we don't have to go to an international multicultural organization to be exposed to intercultural communications and to need a level of intercultural intelligence. It happens every day within our families. Lisa, you talked about how you grew up in this very multicultural environment, and you would be going from one neighbor's house to another, and there would be very different environments. So often we are exposed at very, very early doors in our lives without even realizing. And perhaps that is also one of the reasons why organizations are, in a way, maybe taking it for granted and not necessarily weaving it into their learning and development programs as a way of developing certain skills that people need to be able to effectively communicate, not only with their clients or international offices, but also within the office itself or within the team itself. So I think that's, in a way, a huge missed opportunity. I don't know how you both have seen that.
So when it comes to the business side of things, I noticed that intercultural communication becomes synonymous with cross-cultural communication, and the two are not the same. So cross-cultural communication deals in nationalities and these very specific boxes. It's, you know, how people do things in France in a business setting, and how people do things in Japan, and this is how you should interact in certain business meetings and stuff. And intercultural communication just is, it's a whole different kettle of fish. They are not one and the same, but it almost somehow becomes, we go back to this creatures of habit kind of thing. It's easy to boil it down to these sort of very easy to digest boxes or kind of trainings, in a way, to be like, oh, so when you're on a business trip in Japan, but Japanese people are not one and the same, so that's very misleading information. You know, the same for Americans and all of these different other very very not homogenous countries, where there's a lot of people, a lot of variety and diversity of thought, of experience, of everything, and then we just kind of put a flag on it and we're like, so this is how that works, and it doesn't. And then people are confused when they go to interact with people in what is essentially stereotypes, and then we don't understand why there's, you know, intercultural conflict when actually it's just interpersonal conflict, you know, masked as intercultural communication, when it's actually being sort of, it's a mixture of cross-cultural communication and just interpersonal different understandings and expectations of that communication. So yeah, so for me, that's kind of like where I see a slight problem. We kind of don't acknowledge the complexity because it doesn't make business sense to maybe be so intricate with all of these things, and we want to have them in nice neat boxes. We want to be able to have a one-day training, or we want to be able to do XYZ, and be kind of done with the intercultural aspect of all the things and then get on with our business day. But life is a little bit more complex, a little bit more grey area, and that's just not how it's going to work, unfortunately. So yeah, for me, that's kind of where most of the kinks and the problems lie, to be honest. I don't know what you think, Lisa, maybe.
To add on to that, so yes, I'm glad that you differentiated between cross-cultural and intercultural. To be honest with you, it's a mistake I make myself sometimes. So I think it's something that needs to be very clearly defined. And one way I think about it sometimes, or one example I have of it, I should say, is that I do voice and communication coaching. And a lot of the times my female executives will come to me because they want a certain particular sound of leadership. And they think, oh, my voice is too high, my voice is this, and so women particularly have a hard time in the workplace. No, I'm going to take that back. It's not that they have a hard time, but they put a lot of pressure on themselves to have a certain presence. And a lot of the times it's just not realistic. I think that there's an ideal to, what that presence sounds like, that voice of leadership. It's typically male. It's typically, a white male and with a very booming, round voice. And we love that sound, to be honest with you. It's a great sound, but not everybody can achieve that sound. And they can still have a powerful vocal presence without actually sounding in that one particular way. So how we're tuning into people, going back to the listening, should be a little bit different too. When people come from different parts of the world, like you were talking about now into cross-cultural, but linguistic diversity and how people present is also going to be different. And again, what's our expectation in the company of, okay, what is the culture of the company? What does that sound like? What does that look like? And then, how people are trying to fit themselves into these boxes puts a lot of pressure on people, because it sometimes is, let's say, the unspoken expectation. You think about, okay, how am I supposed to present here if I want to be in that leadership position? But anatomically, we're all very different. I don't know in metrics, and I know for both of you, I was going to say I'm 5'2", but I don't know. So here, there's my American.
It's all right. I grew up in the UK, so I'm
metrics. So yes, I know. I just never understood why we didn't do the metrics thing a little better. But as someone who isn't the biggest in stature, I'm never going to sound like a man who's 6'4" and has this big booming presence, because it's just I could do what I could do. I could maximize my voice. I could understand what I can do best to lean into my style, but to have the expectation that I'm going to sound like something else. And this goes for men and women. I mean, I have men who are smaller in stature, who have a higher pitched voice. I could teach them how to open it up and maximize what they have, for a leadership style, for that communication to be confident. But again, it's, when you look at ideals, there's actually studies that say people who, let's say, have a deeper, more resonant voice, men who have a deeper resonant voice actually make more money. And there's plenty of studies that show this. So, it's what our ideals are, how we envision what leadership looks like, and then how we can change that a little bit.
That how we envision and how we understand what leadership is. And that is, and everything that you talked about is exactly goes back to that we have this standard, this notion of what leadership is. And then people, especially women, because they don't see themselves represented at those levels, will go out of their way, will put all this pressure on themselves, will get all the coaches under the sun just to reach that. But there is also a difference, in terms of what is the reason why they, for instance, would come to you as a communications and pitch coach. Is it because to be that, or whether to open up the full potential of what they have got and create, a grounded, confident, articulated message, get a message across?
It's both. So it depends on the pressure that person puts on themselves. And that going back to the intercultural side, how we communicate with each other in our everyday communications versus, the cross-cultural communication. So I was just touching on those points. But yes, it is both. Some people are very realistic and they want to develop the best version of themselves. Some people are just really putting pressure on themselves to sound a certain way. And every time they hear their voice or every time they see themselves communicate, they're like, oh no, that's not the way I'm supposed to do it. Or that's not the way I want to do it. But the way they want to do it sometimes is just a little unrealistic for their physical build, for who they are, and then sometimes it comes off sounding a little more fake than they wanted it to originally. So yes, I mean, I think that it's also taking the pressure off ourselves to hold up to, okay, this is the standard. This is exactly what we have to be like. Obviously, there's a professionalism that we have to achieve. And also that's going to look different within different cultures as well. We know that, like, the parameters, going back to cross-cultural, that could touch on, how we form relationships, how we communicate with each other, what the politeness is. Those are things that, I mean, I see every day in the people I coach, because I could just see it through even the emails that they send or the way that they address me. But in the end, I think people really globally, put a certain amount of pressure on themselves to sound a certain way or to be a certain way, because that's the way they feel like they have to in order to achieve the success that they want.
Exactly, yeah, because we've been socialized a certain way. There are certain standards that have been around for a long time that are very certain standards that are built for very certain demographic and that serve a very certain demographic. And so there is a lot of redefinition and redefining of leadership that we need to do in the first place. I think that's what we're alluding to. But when we talk about intercultural approach, on one hand, of course, it's about respecting the culture, their boundaries, how people might interpret our message. That being said, it also creates this us versus them dynamic that we've just sort of touched on, because we belong to certain groups, which sometimes limit us to flexibility, agility, open-mindedness to engage with another human being. And because we understand cultural value in comparison to a standard or a particular reference group rather than its own context, and we accept it in its own full, whole right. So I would love to explore, what are the foundations for effective intercultural communications? What are some of the foundations for effective intercultural communications? I would love to get your views on that.
Tina,
would you?
Shall I go first?
I see her.
I mean, can you ever guarantee that it's effective? I mean, but when we come to like communication, you can put all the messages and things out there, but you cannot be in charge of how that person's going to receive that, for example. So you might go into a situation with all of the greatest intentions, and still that communication doesn't go how you expect it to. So effective intercultural communication is that's a tough one, to be honest. But I would say some of the things that people can do to become better at communicating in situations where there is a variety of, you know, diversity of thought and different intersectional layers, is to not rely on knowledge that they have of people's, I don't know, countries of origin, for example, or anything like that. So one thing that I've stopped asking, and I actively make sure I do not ask this, and it actually comes as second nature now, I don't ask people where they're from. I have no interest in knowing where they're from, because that question does not tell me anything fundamentally important or interesting about that person, other than sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of stereotypes that I might otherwise have of somebody from XYZ country based on my kind of understanding of things that I've heard previously, or people I've met previously, because you might meet a really nice person from a country and then you might meet a really horrible one. That's not the country and that's not the rest of the people in the country, so that has no bearing. I don't ask people where they're from, and if somebody wants to tell me, they'll tell me eventually. Like, it's not necessary information for me. Instead, I'm kind of more interested in finding out about that person. What do they like to do? What are they interested in? You know, anything else but where are they from? Because it stops the conversation in its tracks, and then we automatically assume we know everything that we need to know about the person, and we stop asking questions. We stop trying to get to know the person. We stop trying to communicate, because we're then trying to fulfill our understanding of them as a person from that country. So that would be like tip number one, maybe, of how to try and interact in a setting that's more intercultural, whether you know that it's intercultural or not, is don't ask people where they're from, or don't ask questions that kind of have this one track answer to them. Try to be a little bit more clever with your questions. And I think we had this session actually last week in Viber's DEI group, and I think that really ties in nicely with that, is kind of this small talk is a little bit dangerous, you know, because we have to go, oh, where are you from, or what do you do? We, in Finland, people love to ask, what do you do? Because your profession is, you know, it's a thing that people want to know. But then, you know, are we then presuming certain things about a person based on their profession or lack thereof? You know, these are kind of demographic things that you just don't need to know about a person. And, you know, if we're thinking intercultural communication in terms of, you know, societal standing or educational background, do I need to know that somebody has a certain degree or is in a certain job in order to be able to have a conversation with them or communicate with them? Not really. If I know that information, might it somehow cause me to interact with them in a slightly different way, or have some preconceptions about them? Possibly. Whether I like that, you know, to happen or not, it might happen. So I just think, don't go for the easy questions or easy answers. Like, try to be do a little bit more work to communicate with people. Don't go for the lazy, you know, easy to reach off the shelf questions and answers, and try to actually interact with people on a deeper level.
So the bottom line is ban the small talk, but and that's what we talked about last week. But what is really interesting, you know, that you talked about the fact that, you know, don't ask people where you're from unless they, you know, go and tell them that to you themselves. And that's very interesting, because, you know, many might think, but that means that they might not be interested where I'm from. You know, they're not curious enough about me. But actually, it's counter curious, isn't it? Because then, as you said, we straight away, you know, if someone said to me, "Oh, I'm from Russia," we straight away put like potentially every picture of Putin and so on, you know, on top of them. But actually, we
start to have conversations about the political climate instead of them as a person who has a Russian background, or who is a national of Russia. They also, ethnicities in Russia very varied. So being Russian doesn't tell me enough about them as a person and their identity layers to be able to have a full conversation and really see them authentically. So it's so tricky. And I actually personally never had an issue with the question, where are you from, until I returned from the UK to Finland, where the only question I got asked was, where are you from? by Finns, by internationals, by everybody. And I had to try and explain my very complex cultural identity to strangers in the shop, on the bus, when I'm doing basic things in life, just living my life. And so I actually realized how offensive that question is. And for a lot of people, it's the same as, you know, in a different context, but in America, if somebody asks, where are you from? They might be asking, you know, which state or whatever. But if you add in intersections of race or other ethnicity or, you know, things into it, it could be a very offensive question, because then it's like, it gets into this discussion of, no, but where are you from? And these are very like sensitive topics. And these are things I've witnessed happen in Finland to people as well here. So it's not just, you know, for America, or it happens in the UK as well. So it's quite a general question, but it's also a very probing question, because not everyone knows how to answer that. And also, if you're asking that question, sometimes you've come into with an expectation because you've made an assumption about where you think they're from, and you're asking, oh, where are you from? Because you want to be proved correct. And then they say something different, and that's when, again, it invades and invalidates somebody's kind of self-specified identity and also their personal space a little bit. So you're like, no, but like, where are you from? Where are you from? Because one time wasn't enough. So all of these things, for me, I find that this kind of comes under the umbrella of intercultural communication, and this like intercultural intelligence, almost, in a way. Is like, you're able to kind of understand when it's your place to know things and when it isn't, when it's none of your business. You're allowed to ask, but you're not automatically entitled to an answer. And so I just prefer not to ask questions that I don't necessarily need to know the answer to. Like, is it essential in that particular moment for me to know the ethnicity of somebody or the, you know, background of their parents? No, you know. So then people will tell you the things they want you to know in good time. And that's kind of like a thing about communication, is if you genuinely want to get to know somebody and you give them enough time to get to know you and to feel safe with you, you don't have to jump through all of those layers of communication that build the trust to get to the core and then kind of fizzle out this communication situation. You can let it do its own thing, and eventually you will know all the things that you need to know about that person. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of sensitivity to kind of communicating with people in a way that actually you can build trust that's long lasting. But yeah.
Thank you for that perspective, and it definitely really resonates as well. You know, I often get asked, where you're from. You've got a very odd accent, and it is a very interesting question, because, you know, I have lived in several countries, so I can tell you where I was born, but if I give you that answer, it doesn't tell you anything about who I am today, because who I am today has got nothing to do with the country where I was born. And then again, if I tell you, well, yeah, I've lived in 10 years in the UK, that also in isolation doesn't tell you anything about where I'm actually from and how that identity intersects with, you know, this place where I am today. So I also, whenever someone asks me, you know, where I'm from, I actually get very confused within myself. What would be the answer I should be telling? Because, you know, because to myself, I say, I'm a citizen of the world, and I mean that. I live a nomad life, first and foremost. I have lived in many countries. So for me to tell someone where I'm from, you know, is very difficult, but I actually don't have a permanent place to live in, right? And so this is where it also becomes very, very complex, because then I might say, oh, I'm from Latvia, but then I'm sort of saying to myself, but that doesn't mean anything. I haven't been living in that country for, you know, over a decade. It's just where I was born, and my parents weren't even born there. So this is like where, you know, it just gets very complex. So thank you for that perspective, Tina.
And also, just on that as well, when we talk about like, where are we from, like, we also have to take into account the layer of like, legally, where are you from? Like, where do you have rights? Like, where do you have legal rights to be, or which prevent you from being elsewhere? And I'll share with you later a really, really good TED talk by Taya Selassie. I don't know if you've, and I hope I've got her name right, but I'll share it with you. But she basically puts into essence exactly how I feel about the kind of question of where are you from, but I'll share it with you later, and maybe you can share it with like in the chat here.
Thank you.
But yeah, it talks about all of these different layers of like, where are you a local, or where are you legally allowed to be, or, you know, because there are countries that, like she says, like there are countries that didn't exist at the time of when somebody was born, or they existed and no longer exist. So when someone says, where are you from? It's like, well, very hard to pinpoint exactly. So yeah, but it's really interesting kind of topic, but also one that's very, very complex when you really get into, when you really deep dive into it.
Yeah, it's a very common question in New York as well, because New York, I think the assumption in New York is that you're from somewhere else. And so people actually ask that question probably out of curiosity. I mean, I've heard it my whole life. And the funny thing is, Americans tend to, not all Americans, but as you said, America is very, very, very big. And also, depending on where you are, how nationalistic it is, how far back people will go generationally. So, you know, on the coasts or in the cities, you're going to get people who identified more with saying they're Italian American or Irish American, and they identified very closely with those things. I mean, you know, my grandparents came over from Italy, and that was part of the culture I grew up with. So I grew up with them in my home. I heard the language, I heard the culture, just like a lot of other people did. And so they identified very closely with both of those things. Funny enough, when I actually go abroad, I typically say I'm a New Yorker. I don't usually say American ever, because it's just identify with being from this city as if it was its own little country, but obviously it's not. But it is something that was very, very commonly asked here. And as I've gotten to know people in professional situations, you know, people have said the same thing that you said, that for them, they feel like it's more intrusive, because then they, you know, don't feel like maybe they're from here, or they're afraid that people are not thinking they're from here. So I do understand that it could be very difficult for different people. I think some people do like to talk about where they're from, just to bring different perspectives to the table. I've had many people volunteer that information, especially when I work with them, and they'll talk about their own beliefs. I mean, so and this is typically ethnically, so they'll talk about, you know, what they're used to as far as communication or interpersonal relationships. And I think that, you know, that affects the way people do business and communicate as well. So, you know, their expectation, again, of like forming relationships, of how they feel at work. I've had Italian clients will say to me, you know, I'm so used to being part of a group and being invited to dinner and, you know, having much more close personal ties at work. And then you come to the States where everybody's super friendly, but nobody's inviting you over. And it's very hard for people to get used to that. And they'll say that. Or I have Russian clients that will say, you know, it's making me nuts because I want some feedback and everybody just keeps telling me this looks great. And I know it doesn't. I want someone to tell me it doesn't look great. This is what I have to fix. And I actually have to say, what do I need to fix? And so these are the types of things where I think the culture comes into play, and people will say like, okay, listen, you know, like I'm Russian, or I'm, you know, like I need it direct. Can you just tell me very directly what I'm supposed to be doing here? So, I mean, it comes up, like you said, it's volunteered through people, but people, I mean, I think people are also very proud about all the places they've lived and where they're from. And they'll usually volunteer it if very, very vocally, if they want to say it. And, you know, I think it's something that, again, like I said, maybe it's my experience with people because of the way I coach them, and because I have to coach on communication. And so these come up a lot more, that people will discuss the nuances and what they see as different and the same. Also, I mean, there's certain things that are the same across the board. And again, I think the end goal of communication is the same. We want relationships, we want success, we want to, you know, be bonded to people, but how we get there might be just a little bit different.
Thank you for that. It's you are absolutely right, and I was also thinking about, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, where organizations are so loud and proud about their multicultural operations and multicultural workforce, and yet from diversity, equity, and inclusion point of view, you know, they might have a diverse workforce on paper, but then how do they actually derive value from that workforce through, you know, equitable and inclusive practices is very different to just having a diverse workforce. And that's where there are certain, principles and certain level of intelligence, be it intercultural communications, be it cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence, physical intelligence, that all need to come together and intersect to create the environment where actually we produce value and we also derive value. But right now, it sounds, at least it seems fairly one-dimensional how we go about these topics, because we only want to, again, put people in boxes, put topics in boxes, and then what we want out of them are specific metrics, specific, bipolar clear metrics. But again, that is not necessarily, how it works. So I'm actually quite curious whether you've got, any more tips of how organizations can derive value from their culturally diverse workforce, especially where the onus and not necessarily onus, the emphasis on diversity is so high right now. How can organizations actually can derive value from their cultural workforce by applying intercultural intelligence and principles? Any tips that you can share?
Sure. So I think that looking at your workforce, it's going to probably take a little more work than is happening now. I think it's going to take really getting to know your talent and what they're good at, and then building the talent from the perspective of, okay, so we have this huge talent pool, and they're coming from all over the world. Let me think about what their experiences are, what they're bringing to the table, and how they can enhance the company. I mean, there's been multiple studies that show that companies with more diversity are going to be more successful. So why is that? It's probably because of the way people come at the world and think about the world. So in knowing that, getting to know your employees, and that's where I think there's two things, right? Like in the beginning, there's that superficial, get to know someone really quick because it's a job interview. It's, you're pitching for funding. It's, and unfortunately in those situations, we don't have a lot of time to get to know someone very well and build those trusts. We're coming at it probably, unfortunately, from a little bit more of a superficial level. It's those first interactions. So this is where we, I think, have to train ourselves, again, to tune in possibly differently and start to look at things, a little bit differently as far as the communicator sitting in front of you. What are they bringing to the table? Again, are they very data driven? Are they that engineer brain where, regardless of where in the world they're from, are they coming to the table with, the facts and the details that you need, or, super process oriented, or are they the storyteller? And those are the types of things, like those are all valuable additions to the team. Those are more behavioral types, but then add again, this layer of, okay, so coming from all these different places in the world, what are they bringing to the table, and how are they making the team better? What's their position on the team? And let's really, let's embrace that. Let's develop that as people who develop talent when they look at their teams, especially right now, because I mean, there's we're having such a hard time retaining a workforce. What's going to enhance the workforce? What's going to retain the workforce? And I think it's when people feel understood, feel like they're being heard, and I think that if they start to look at the diversity of their team and say, okay, this guy, let's say he's from Italy. Yes, he's bringing all these things to the table, maybe taking the assumptions out of the equation. Let's think about all the unique things that he brings to the team or she brings to the team, and how they're enhancing the team. How do we bring the best out from each place?
What is the value add, isn't it? So that's the $1 million question. And often in job description, and this is something that I was talking about yesterday as well, that there is a difference between culture fit and culture add.
Mm-hmm.
Whether we want someone to assimilate the main culture, or actually are we accepting them in their own full whole right?
Oh, that's
Thank
a hard
you for
one.
that perspective. Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
A
people.
hard one.
Exactly, and that's a question that organizations need to ask themselves internally. Not only what is a culture fit, because I would say that. So there is research. I'll start with that. So there is research that shows that actually homogeneous teams, so teams that look and think the same,
Mm-hmm.
actually outperform heterogeneous teams on all counts, unless where the hetero team outperforms a homogeneous team by miles, or a diverse team outperforms by mile, is when there is psychological safety.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is the key factor. And so then again, there are plenty of intercultural there's plenty in intercultural intelligence that I think helps unpinning that and creating those spaces, those safe spaces, those containers where people can start bringing them full selves and not being judged and punished for that. Or not needing to put all that pressure on themselves to assimilate the main culture.
I mean, I think the tougher part there is the industry also, depending on, I mean, organizations is a big word, but it really depends on what industry you're coming from. Are you coming from a really deeply rooted traditional industry like finance? Is it, a 150-year-old company where the culture has been so deeply rooted? Now we're thinking about changing, as opposed to, let's say, a new innovative tech company that started thinking like this from the onset. It's different jobs for different organizations, and it's going to be a very different fix, I think, for different styles. The law is also one. Any kind of legal firms like that have been around for a long time. Big law. Those, again, there's a certain way to look. There's a certain way. It doesn't matter depending on where you come from in the country. It doesn't matter. Once you get in there, the culture is pretty strong. They're going to expect a certain type of performance. They're going to expect you to deliver a certain way, because this is and again, there's a lot of regulations. There's not as much room for wiggle. So you could come in from all parts of the world, but I think they're still going to have certain expectations, as opposed to advertising, let's say, or digital media, where you might have a little more play because it's just a different type of setting.
And it is interesting. You're absolutely right. There are organizations that are just very, very stiff in their approach. And, there are offices, probably, even more so in New York, Wall Street, where you would walk in and just the culture would hit you in the face, like, steam in Finnish sauna, right? You would be able to, it would be palpable. Mm-hmm. Tina?
I guess my question is, what does that organisation understand cultural diversity as? So if we're talking, for example, some companies, they like to advertise how many different passports their organisation has in terms of their staff. We have 153 different passports in our staff. We speak X and X many languages and this kind of stuff, these very tangible cultures. But passports are not a sign of cultural diversity if everybody graduated from an Ivy League university, or like that. There's no diversity of thought or experience if everyone's parents are from well-to-do families, and so culture and diversity kind of, national culture is one thing, but there's class systems in certain countries that are very, very, very tangible, very easy to see, and not everybody's able to, climb up the ranks of certain class systems to be able to achieve the same end results as other people. So when you have people with certain passports in your organization, you have to ask, how is this person, for example, different from somebody else who has a trust fund? Like these kinds of things, because a passport is not necessarily an indicator of actual diversity. In various other aspects, it just shows that you come from a different national cultural background. So again, like, how do we understand cultural diversity as an organization is quite important. Is there actual diversity, or is there just tick box diversity? So, yeah.
Great point. And unfortunately, we are seeing more of the latter right now.
Well, I think that goes back to cultural versus cognitive diversity, right? Like, so, right. There could be, like you said, a million different people on your team, several different speakers, several different cultural backgrounds, but, cognitively, people are coming from very similar places. So, and I think, again, we see that in a lot of companies, because, again, going back to the company culture, it's then when you enter that company culture, how well are you going to be able to fit into the company culture? And I think that's going to be a much harder fix as far as changing that, because of the standards of, let's say, that industry and what the expectations of that industry are for performance. So, and unfortunately, like, those preconceived notions of who could perform like that, regardless of where they come from in the world. I mean, and I think this is just, unfortunately, it's one of those things, right? If you have an Ivy degree, no matter from where in the world, I mean, if you are Ivy, it's going to, have one sort of ticket that I think people still are very trained to say, okay, hey, this guy went to Harvard or INSEAD, but and they might walk in the door a lot faster than, unfortunately, someone like you said, who doesn't have that because of how people think. And I think that's a global thing. Unfortunately, I haven't met too many people or too many countries that are, that have changed that yet. Even though we talk about it, we have all this talk now about, go on experience, don't worry about degrees, but I haven't actually seen people doing that yet.
No, I totally, and it is interesting how things are changing, and I'm actually very curious to see how things are going to be changing also post-pandemic, because that also has created different kinds of standards and expectations from education, and how we contribute to organizations. But both ladies, you have shared a lot of nuggets and insights and information, and I'm just curious, as we are sort of wrapping up the conversation, as we are quickly coming to an end to it, what would be your top tip for our people who are joining us today or watching us on replay for evolving their cultural intelligence and communication? So Tina already mentioned one, don't ask me where I'm from, but are there any other tips that people can do and apply today to start evolving their intercultural intelligence?
I think mine goes back to how we listen. So when you're tuning in, what are your preconceived notions? Understand yourself. What are my preconceived notions when I come to the table? What am I expecting? And when I first meet this person, is that blocking me from further wanting to either get to know them or asking those questions? Am I making those quick judgments? And can I check myself and overcome it to keep talking, to keep probing, to keep getting to know the person, even if my unfortunate unconscious biases or conscious biases kick in? How can I push past it? How can I listen differently and really start to understand, okay, this might not be what I think it is right from the start.
Thank you for that. Yeah, listening, self-awareness, emotion is the absolute foundation for any of the work, any of the things that we are talking about today.
I would maybe just add that overall people are more similar than they are different, and if we keep that in mind, then I think we can get quite far in life. So there's a lot more similarities between us, regardless of passports or languages, and that there would ever be differences if we really bothered to kind of think of the other person as not opposite of you or different to you, but try to find the things that are similar in their communication styles or the ways they think. I think we'll realize that we just notice the differences because they are highlighted more so than with our friends, who we also have differences with. We're not one homogenous group of people, even as a nation or a group of friends or anything. Like, I have debates with some of my friends all the time. We have very different viewpoints on life, and we might have grown up in very similar backgrounds and come from a lot of similar kind of experiences and stuff, but we are still very much communicating in slightly different ways because that's just the nature of people. So yeah, and
I echo that as well, because again, when we talk about, let's say, organizations, and again go into the diversity and inclusion conversation, we often hear organizations are building silos within their own organizations to serve a very specific person, and ultimately where that is coming from is on only seeing the differences and seeing all the different identities one person can pile up on themselves. But again, when it comes to culture, I think we again have to see more of, as you said, Tina, our similarities and what are the things that unite us as humanity. And within any organization, regardless of the background, age, ethnicity, we will always be looking to be respected, to be heard, to be safe, to be provided for and be able to provide for our families. So those are fundamentals that we will always be looking for, regardless of what are the social identities that have been put on us or we have put on ourselves. So looking at the similarities and seeing the other person as another human being is huge. Yet, as we have witnessed, it's much harder. It's easier said than done. But ladies, Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you both coming on this LinkedIn Live, and Lisa, it's been very early where you are. So thank you both, and thank you everyone who's joined us today. Thank you for anyone who might be watching us on a replay. Feel free to connect in with both Tina and Lisa. As you can see, they've got a lot to share and a lot of value to add to this topic. And I shall see you again next week when we are going to be talking about asking powerful questions and the importance and power that these questions might carry. And I've got two, again, fantastic guests who are going to be joining me, and I look forward to seeing you then. So in the meanwhile, take good care, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies. It's been very, very interesting. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.